to Dr. Tihal Singh, we would now like to invite Devashish Banerjee for his talk on integral yoga.
This can somebody show me how this operates? Just, this is a okay. Okay, so this goes back, this goes forward, and this one is the point. Good evening, everybody.
Speak up.
Okay, is that better?
Oh, yes.
Better. By the power of technology. So, heard this lovely talk by my friend Thanishwar. What I'm going to say will have a lot of overlap with what you're saying because we belong to the same orbit of thinking. And so today I'm going to talk about education, and actually without using the word education, Thanishwar talked a lot about education. He talked about another kind of education, and that is what, in a sense, I'm also going to touch on. And I'm going to talk about some modern teachers of yoga in India, Sri Aurobindo and his partner, who was French. Her name was, she has been called the mother, her name was Mira Alfassa, and how it relates to yoga and how it relates to education. So firstly, about education, we're here in a university and you all have gone to school, and all of us, wherever we are, some of us, Thanishwar has come from Nepal, I've come from India, Nalini Rao from India. We are here because there has been some commonality to our understanding of education. We've come up in schools which allowed us to transfer from place to place. There are texts that are the same, there are ideas that are the same, there are ideas that are not allowed into that educational ambit. So we have to think about what it is that we commonly hold as education in our time and place. And to do this, we go back. I mean, it's amazing, firstly, even to think that there is a common education all over the world. It's the common condition of modernity. Modernity is not a phenomenon that is localized. It does not belong to a certain region. It's a worldwide phenomenon. For the first time in Earth history, we have certain criteria that have spread all over the world. And how did this come about? What is allowed inside it and what is not allowed inside it? And so we go back to the foundations of modernity in what may be called the European Enlightenment and the modern knowledge academy that is born out of that, to which we belong. And we find that Thanishwar used the word consciousness quite a bit. But we didn't probe what consciousness means to us. What does it mean to everybody? And there are some assumptions about consciousness. So one of these assumptions is that reason is consciousness. See, we talk about biologically about the cerebrum as the generator of consciousness, the conscious part of the mind. What about the rest? Well, it's supposed to be subconscious or unconscious. So there is only one part in us that is conscious, which is the reasoning part of the mind. So this assumption or equation of consciousness with reason, or the reasoning part of the mind, is part of our modern legacy. It's part of what modernity is all about. And it emerges out of the European Enlightenment. It's a post-Enlightenment assumption. And we can see how that actually occurs, because the Enlightenment is not a uniform movement. It occurs due to minds that think alike and create a system of ideas. But part of this system of ideas, we talk about it as enlightenment because it is not the same as when we use the word enlightenment for the Buddha's enlightenment, for example. This enlightenment means coming to a kind of rational knowledge about the world. And as a movement that moves from the pre-modern to the modern, puts behind it other notions of what it means to be enlightened. What it means to be enlightened arises out of an amazing intuition that is that we can understand the laws of the world. How is it that we can understand the laws of things? How can somebody like Newton give us the laws of motion that can predict how things move in the material world? We have something in us that actually understands the mind of God. Something in us that can give the same kind of laws that have been given to us. So that idea is something which is central to the Enlightenment. And along with it comes the idea of education, which is what spawns the Modern Knowledge Academy. And that idea of education is that if we all put our minds together, if we all put our reason together, we can come up with all the laws, and ultimately maybe with one law in the hierarchy of laws that will explain everything to us. We'll arrive at enlightenment. So that is the objective of education in the Modern Knowledge Academy. It is knowledge production to arrive at the laws of all things. And along with it comes a practical goal, which is also a kind of transition out of the pre-modern. And that is that we are enabled because somehow God has given us His own faculty, the faculty of reason. So we are enabled to better God's word. In a sense, modernity and the Enlightenment is not a kind of a anti-faith movement. It is its own faith. It's also a faith movement. And so, an application of knowledge to create a perfect world. These are the real goals, the secret, we may say the esoteric, divine goals of the Modern Knowledge Academy. Now, in some sense, it sounds quite glorious, but we haven't really questioned what is the meaning of consciousness in it. We are talking about a certain type of consciousness. And because each human being is located in space and time, we have short lives compared to the span of history. And we live in a small space compared to the whole world. The idea is that if we can gather the knowledge that we produce in a lifetime, according to certain methodological standardized formulae, and if we can archive it according to certain standardization. As soon as I came in here, I saw this little slip here saying, what is an archive? Archive is a really important thing to the Modern Knowledge Academy. Production and archiving. So, we can transcend our limited, narrow life in space and time. 100 years from now, somebody will come across my work may not know my name, but will be working on top of that, adding to that, to complete the Enlightenment project. But there is a small voice of doubt underneath it all. Can totality be produced by an additive process? Or do we only produce more and more? There is no real addition that is going on. What is going on is the construction of larger and larger wholes. Or we are moving towards certain kinds of vanishing points, but not ever reaching it. So there are problems to this idea, this so-called divine idea of the modern knowledge academy. One is the fragmentation of knowledge. It just creates more and more and more specialization. The second is what the philosopher Heidegger has called the production of standing reserve. Standing reserve means that what we are doing is we are stopping the movement of time and we are gathering knowledge and archiving it. We are creating a huge database where everything is resource. And it is at our command. Whenever we want to, we can call on something and see its properties and make it move to do what we want it to do. It has no real will to itself because we've stopped its own movement. This is the standing reserve that has been created, and in a sense, it freezes the world as a kind of a picture. And that causes what another philosopher, a post-Heideggerian philosopher, Habermas, has called the colonization of the life world. The world of life, the world of experience, of taste, of feel, of affect, is colonized by this frozen database that we are gathering by the use of our minds to create this enlightened picture. Now, this has been critiqued. The reason I brought up names like Heidegger and Habermas is not just to show that there are philosophers around who talked about these things, but to also bring to notice the fact that there is a strong internal critique of this going on right now. Modern philosophy has a very strong component of critique against the very knowledge academy that we are sitting in. But this critique comes also from the non-Western peripheries of the modern knowledge academy. And that's what we are talking about. That is what Stanishwar talked about today. And that's what I'm talking about. And one of the people who launched this kind of critique in India was Sri Aurobindo. And he proposed an alternative view of what he called integral education. So I come from an institute in San Francisco called the California Institute of Integral Education, or Integral Studies. And we are very fortunate. I want to acknowledge President Emeritus of California Institute of Integral Studies is here with us, Dr. Joe Subiondo. This institute was started by a student of Sri Aurobindo. Haridas Chaudhuri was just like this university here that has been started by a non-Western thinker. So too, California Institute of Integral Studies was started by an Indian thinker who brought his own kinds of ideas to propose an integral education. And the first tenet of integral education is that consciousness is not just reason. Consciousness is not just mind. That if we want to call it mind, there are layered forms of subjectivity that we have to include as being conscious. And that's why I liked so much when Stanishwar was talking about the life of plants, the emotions of plants. Plants also experience. All things are conscious. In a sense, can we even deny consciousness to this day? maybe it is a little more attenuated than our consciousness. But can we say that this is not conscious? The tantric system that Staneshwar was talking about starts from the assumption that everything is conscious. Consciousness is all the way down. There is nothing unconscious. So we may also know in multiple ways. We don't have to know only with the mind. Knowing with the mind and thinking that one is enlightened because one has gathered the laws of the universe that can be understood by the mind is a very narrow slice of our conscious knowledge of consciousness. Not that it is not part of the knowledge of consciousness. It is also part of the knowledge of consciousness, but only a narrow slice. So, integral education would start with that assumption that there are other ways of knowing, and how can we find these ways of knowing? How can we cultivate them? Again, Staneshwar used the term cultivating consciousness. That's exactly what this is about. How can we cultivate these other ways of knowing? Because what we've done with our lives is we've frozen or dwarfed all the other forms of consciousness that we have. That's why he talked about compassion. Compassion is one of those forms. But can we form a science of consciousness that informs our education, that can actually make us fully human, that can make us holistic, integral beings, and give us an education that is an integral education, the whole that is sought for by the Enlightenment, but which the Enlightenment cannot reach because it's looking at only a small slice of consciousness. So are there centers? What are these? Is there a science of consciousness first? And are there centers that integrate these forms of consciousness? Or are we, modern philosophers have talked about colonization of the life world, and if we actually look at the whole history of civilization, we find that there is this tussle between what is called civilization and barbarism. But if we talk about it in slightly other terms, this tussle, this history of civilization can also be seen as a continuous history of the subjugation of the life world by the mind. To be civilized is to actually call the life world barbaric. And this also beautifully was touched on by Staneshwar when he was talking about the fact that we don't put our emotions aside. We don't say that this is not civilized. It's civilized because all the consciousness has to be accounted for in a civilization that is integral. Otherwise, what we are creating is a battleground for the subjugation of a whole part of our existence. And this is what civilization has ended up becoming today. So what are these forms of consciousness? Is there a science for it? And are there points of integration that are not a speaking for? The mind is speaking for the life. The mind is speaking for the body. The male is speaking for the female. Is that what's going on, or is there a true center that does not speak for because it has become everything else? So that is the question. So Sri Aurobindo was involved in trying to answer these types of questions. And these are the pictures of Sri Aurobindo and his collaborator, the mother. She was called, he designated her the mother. She was French. Sri Aurobindo himself had his early education in England and came back to India after his, at that time he was studying his bachelor's at Cambridge University, and he came back. So he had a very good understanding of the Western Knowledge Academy. And came back and versed himself, as a student of classics at Cambridge University. he studied Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit. But when he came back, he really dived into the Indian tradition, both the Sanskritic tradition as well as the vernacular traditions. And gradually informed himself and came into contact with the world of yoga. The mother was French, and she came up in the cultural milieu of the revolutions in art and culture that were going on in Paris in the late 19th century. But along with it, there was a very strong counterculture of esoteric thinking in Europe, which is part of the whole modernist movement. And she was intimately connected with that. And so their coming together actually represents a bridging of East and West as well. They found synergy in the deep esoteric understanding of both these cultures. And so we find that Sri Aurobindo in his early writings is actually writing in terms of the Indian yogic tradition. He's using Sanskrit terms. His own diaries are peppered with Sanskrit writing. But after the mother comes, his public writings begin a transition to a more, what one might call universal language. He writes in English and he's creating new terms. And this creation of new terms, the creation of concepts, is a very important aspect of our movement into a kind of a modern and a critical space within modernity. And so one may say that this kind of language that he created is the precursor of what today we call consciousness studies and transpersonal psychology. These are new disciplines. And the whole idea behind these disciplines is to voice a more holistic understanding of consciousness, which is of the kind that Sanishwar was talking about, bridging some of these ancient understandings and a contemporary understanding in an international language. So there are a number of concepts that he brings together, but one of the really important concepts that has to do with this layered understanding of consciousness is something that he got from the Taittiriya Upanishad. And this is one of the Upanishads. It is given, at least in Western chronology, to be about 8th century BCE. And part of it is talking about a division of consciousness into various layers or kinds of consciousness. We can talk about degrees and kinds. A degree is a gradation within a kind. But we have different kinds of consciousness. And these kinds, you can see the Sanskrit names in that diagram there. So Annamaya, Pranamaya, Manomaya, Vijnanamaya, Anandamaya, these are terms that I used. And in translating them, Sri Aurobindo is using terms like physical, vital, mental, and these can be bodies. In other words, the body that we take for granted, which is the physical body, that is called Annamaya Sharira. But already in the Annamaya Sharira, the science of consciousness is talking about two layers, Sthula and Sukshma. The body is not as gross as we take it to be. It is not purely material. There is an astral component to it as well. There is an etheric or astral component to it as well. And behind it are other sheaths or other bodies that are even more subtle. So there is and what's interesting is at the time that Sri Aurobindo was writing this, many of these words were very new and we didn't have much currency of these concepts. But today we talk about chronic healing, for example. We talk about the term vital, which he used, was in use in France at that time. There was a famous philosopher, Henri Bergson, whose philosophy can be called vitalism. That's what he called it, which is essentially the life force. And he was talking exactly about other kinds of consciousness. The vital consciousness is different from the physical consciousness or the mental consciousness. And then the mind is the mental consciousness. And then he was also talking about forms of cosmic consciousness. You can talk about our consciousness being contained within the body. But if there is consciousness all the way down, there have to be forms of disembodied cosmic consciousness that are individualized in individual entities. And these forms of consciousness for him were actually not even beyond the mind. Our human mind occupies a certain range of consciousness. Just as we know that every animal that has some organization of its nervous material has some amount of mental brain. And we may say that there is mind even in this, in the plant, but that mind is diffused, disorganized, or unorganized. But once you start having senses and you start having some kind of central control to the senses, you're beginning to have an organized mental physicality, a physical structure to the mental consciousness. So the kind of mentality that we express is, in some sense, we take it to be much more than that of the animal. But even biologically, it's not that different. We just express a much greater range of rationality. But there is some rationality to all beings that have a brain, even the cockroach. So we find we can easily understand that there may be other ranges of mentality that have not been organized in us. And these ranges of mentality can be cosmic. They don't need to be embodied within individuals, because they are outside and belongs to the entire, what we call the noosphere. The nous, the cosmic mind. So even beyond that, they were going, this Upanishad is a really interesting Upanishad, and it is the center to one of the primary, kind of tenets of reality, according to the Upanishads. And that is that bliss is the foundation of all things. Ananda is the foundation of all things. This is not the only view there is. In India itself, Buddha was opposing it completely by saying dukkha is the foundation of all things. But these people were putting at the peak bliss, pure bliss, bliss as the very foundation of consciousness. So we find these three psychological realms or bodies, the physical, vital and mental, and two cosmic sheets or bodies, causal and bliss. And the Upanishad enjoins the rise of consciousness from the psychological bodies to the cosmic bodies to know the origin. Get to the origin, then you'll know what has become all these things. You'll also know that that is the purity of consciousness, the essence of consciousness, that has become kinds of consciousness below it. But once reaching there, you can come back down the ladder and find that that has become mental consciousness, vital consciousness, physical consciousness, and therefore integrate it. You can climb up and down the ladder, which is really the aim also of the Hermetic tradition. The Western Hermetic tradition is something that the mother was very familiar with. You can see that there is a cross between these two. So now we come to what's Staneshwar, my little crossover with Staneshwar. And that is Tantra. Now, Tantra, I've again put the kind of more accepted modern dating 6th century where the texts were being written. But the practices may go back to 2500 BC, where we find that seals of the Indus Valley are showing yogis that are trying to raise their kundalini. Maybe, we're not sure. But this energy work, the work of actually harnessing deep energy inside the human system, is something that has a very long history that goes back to the prehistory of the human. So that actually subdivides the system, what we just talked about as the kinds of consciousness, physical, vital, mental, etc. It subdivides them into these centers in the human being that are situated in the Sukshma Sharira, in the astral body, not in the physical body, but connected with the physical body. In terms of these centers of consciousness related to these types of or kinds of consciousness. And already we find the notion of this verticality. The human being is a vertical being. Again, this is made a lot of in the Hermetic tradition as well. And this verticality of the human, which relates to what is called the axis mundi in the Greek and Hermetic systems, is really the pillar that connects heaven and earth. And that pillar, that invisible pillar, is hymned in the Atharva Veda as the Skambha. Skambha becomes the Stambha of Ashoka. But Skambha is the hymns to Skambha in the Atharva Veda, is really glorifying this vertical axis that connects heaven and earth, that is replicated in every human being. Every one of us has that one version of that ladder of consciousness. And that is a subdivision into these 7 what are called chakras. And you can see the names are all mentioned there. There is one physical chakra, the Mooladhara. And then you have 3 connected to the vital body. One is at the sex center, one is at the navel center, one is at the heart. And they are the Swadhisthana, the Manipura, and the Anahata, they are called. And then you have 3 that belong to the mental body. One is at the throat level, the Vishuddhi, between the eyebrows, Ajna, and then above the head, which is called the Sahasrara, or 1,000-petaled lotus. Now these centers, they're very interesting because this is in a way the entire basis of Tantra is about these centers. These centers are individual and cosmic at the same time. You can control or you can come into contact with a layer of cosmic consciousness. It's as if there is a sort of a plane of consciousness. Each one is an individualization of a plane of consciousness. And so the idea is that if one were to really cultivate these centers, one would in some sense be contacting these different kinds of consciousness, cultivating these different kinds of consciousness that form us as holistic human beings. Now, usually what is the use that is made of this entire system, just like we saw in the Taittiriya Upanishad, the use was to ascend in consciousness from the more material to the more subtle and ultimately to the highest pure consciousness, and then see that in the rest of the being. So, of course, the goals are not all the same. Some want to disappear in the highest, and some want to bring the highest down. So we find that in the tantric system, the idea is that there is a kind of a source of latent consciousness below the spine. That is the Kundalini. Again, as Stanishwar pointed out wonderfully, it's not a snake that is coiled there. It's an energy source that is coiled. Just as we know that potential energy is represented by a spring. A spring, when it is made to open up, uncoils itself and becomes kinetic or kinetic energy. So the idea is, how can we, make that source of latent consciousness active, and how can we make it rise up the ladder of those centers, opening each of them and going up into a certain kind of unity with its source above. Now this has become a kind of almost a standard or standardized understanding of Tantra. But there are two variations that if you actually go to tantric schools, you'll find out, or even look at the tantric texts, you'll find out very few of them before the 16th century have actually 7 chakras. Some of them have more and some of them have less. And it depends really on what is the aim or goal of that particular school. Because to some extent, you can further subdivide it. And attention creates. If you put your attention, it's almost like saying we have a fretless bass. And depending on how you play the bass, you are actually stringing the bass and putting its frets for it, creating your own individualized frets for it. That is one thing. And then the other thing is that there are also ancient traditions, including traditions within Kashmir Shaivism, that talk of the possibility of the descent of energy rather than only the ascent of the Kundalini. Shakti can descend. There can also be two processes, descending and ascending, and the meeting of the two currents. So there's a lot more variation. It's not just each of these things that we are talking about is a field of experimentation. It's a field of study, not a kind of cut and dry single thing that you're told and you have to believe. You're being told this exists, but it is for you to experiment and find out what it is that you need. Sri Aurobindo was to say that humanity has evolved since the time of the discovery of these things in certain ways. And one of those interesting ways is that very thing that we are critiquing, the growth of the mental consciousness. The human mind and the modern academy, one of the things it has done is created a greater sense of universality. We have created comparative studies. We have created structuralism. In all these forms of studies, we are actually thinking in a cosmic way. We are trying to bring together all world mythologies. We are trying to find what is the core in it. This attempt has actually taken us to the peaks of the human mind, so that in a sense, that 1,000-petaled lotus, which was completely closed to us before, is stirring. And it is possible that if we actually call down the energy from there, it is much closer to us than the difficult exercises that raise the Kundalini. So he was to say that there are other ways by which we can quiet the mind and bring down the force from above, so that it actually activates these chakras and causes the Kundalini. It's as if the Kundalini going up can connect with the 1,000-petal lotus. Here you are reversing the process. The energy from the 1,000-petal lotus can come down and open up the gates of the Kundalini, which rises instead. The thing to say about this is not whether it is true or false, but again, what I said, we have to look at these things as fields of experimentation, not cut and dried truths. Everything is actually a gate to an entire range of possibilities that we need to experiment and explore. We have not done so because we believe in a dogma. The dogma that consciousness belongs only over here. The other thing to note is that, as I said, these forms or these models of human consciousness were put to certain uses, and we imbibe the use along with the model. So we say that, oh, this is meant to attain samadhi, enter into deep trance, and leave the world. But what we have to look at today is we have problems of our own in our time. How can this archive of practices and experimentation aid us now for our problems today? How can we find what it means to be integral as a functioning model for human existence, for social and cultural existence? And these kinds of this archive, talk about archives, this is another kind of archive. This archive can help us if we enter into it in the right way. So that is, in a sense, the way that Sri Aurobindo approached this tradition. Now, these are the chakras. I think, again, Staneshwar started by pointing out what the Muladhara is given traditionally. These traditional yantras, and I think, again, how meaning emerges in diagrams, in visuals, in a visual form, and how meaning is coded into phonemes, into sounds, mantras. These are brought together in these diagrams. So one way, the traditional way of actually cultivating the kinds of consciousness related to these various layers of consciousness is to focus on these yantras. These are like yantras. The word yantra literally means machine, means engine or machine or instrument. And the idea is that they are energy machines, they are energy formations. If you visualize them, if you repeat the mantra, they are activated and they bring their energy formations into action inside you. So meditations and following these particular, you see, when we talk about thinking, we take it for granted that thinking takes place over here. But if you close your eyes in meditation and try to put your attention on one of the chakras for long enough, you'll find that you can operate from there. It is as if your center of consciousness has moved to some other point. You're not operating from the mind. You can operate from your heart. You can operate from your navel. Certain cultures give a lot of importance to that. The Japanese culture, they call it the hara. And martial artists put a lot of attention on actually operating from the hara. So depending on what you want to cultivate, you can put your attention on that and just reside there, operate from there. See what it feels like. See what kinds of awareness arise, what you're connecting with in the world. So that is one thing that is related to this. But we can also approach this, I say also, not to say that this is irrelevant, this is profound, this has been time tested, and therefore this is what can always give us the opening to these particular realms or kinds of consciousness. But even in terms of our modern everyday lives, we can see that there are things that we can do that actually help us to cultivate these different kinds of consciousness. And so we can go to the more modern language of the physical, vital, etc. and see how they relate to these layers of consciousness, and see what kinds of things we can do to cultivate the kind of consciousness that they imply, that will give us a more holistic life. So for the physical consciousness itself, asanas are a practice that are traditionally used. They allow us to open up the consciousness of the body itself. The body has its own consciousness. And the body consciousness is explored in some secular or social activities as well, such as sports. Sports pursued according to one's own proclivities, what one is moved towards, can enter a certain zone where the body operates by its own consciousness. It doesn't necessarily listen to the brain, it is operating by itself. There's a certain autonomous operation of the body that can occur. That is actually tapping into the consciousness of the body as a kind of consciousness. One of the thinkers closely connected with California Institute of Integral Studies is Michael Murphy. And he's written a beautiful book called The Future of the Body. He was an athlete himself. That book is all about this body consciousness as an independent form of consciousness and what is possible to us through opening up that particular consciousness. People who learn musical instruments often have this experience where at a certain point, even before the mind thinks, the hand does. Some musicians work at such a high level of proficiency, it's impossible for the mind to control the body or the hands when they move at that speed. The hands are moving by their own consciousness. It's become an autonomous consciousness. In the East Asian tradition, calligraphy was taken as one of these ways of opening up the body consciousness, where you brought what you wanted to write into the hands, into the body, and then portrayed it. And I don't know if some of you know about the history of Japanese culture. In the early 20th century, when modernization was going on in Japan, there was a strong debate about switching from the brush to the pencil. And for a while, the people who said that we should not switch to the pencil but hold the brush, because the brush allows this kind of flexibility and calligraphic sort of facility to emerge much more than the pencil does. The pencil is more a mental kind of instrument, a rational instrument. But the brush is an instrument of animism. That's why physical and vital can express through the brush. And finally, in your everyday life, you can cultivate physical consciousness through getting the intuition of measurement. Sometimes, good cooks, they know exactly how much salt to put. But the person who doesn't always makes a mess of it. It's more or less. How do they know? They don't actually use a measuring spoon to do it. They just look at it, pick up the right amount and put it. It's physical intuition that is working. It's physical consciousness. The body itself knows. It knows without any other input what to do. So these kinds, there was a Japanese-American architect. His name was George Nakashima. And he was in Connecticut. This man was practicing some of these kinds of things. And he came to a point where he could measure out for a building the right size of wood by just walking to it and putting his hand on the right place. He dispensed with the ruler, the measuring stick. And he was always right. He came to that. He has beautiful buildings, and furniture that he constructed. But he did it because he wanted to develop this form of knowledge. This is a kind of knowledge. And we need to open up this kind of knowledge as well. Then we have the will. The will is usually part of our animal heritage. Animals have an instinct that allows them to carry out what they want to do with perfect will. And the vital or the life force in us is controlled in the Indian tradition through breathing exercises, pranayama. But similarly, the Chinese have the Tai Chi and Qigong to do a similar kind of balancing of the vital energy. And we can gradually, once this is opened up, we can learn how to direct energy. Healing practices, pranic healing is all about that. It's about directing vital energy. And so, by experimenting with it, we can actually intensify our vital life, the life of the vital energy. Now, I use the term psychic or soul. And I use it because at the time when I talked about the chakras and about the kinds of consciousness, I mentioned that there are often more than 7 chakras or etc. And some schools have 8 chakras. And often they talk about something called the Ananda Kanda. Ananda Kanda is a center which is behind the heart. And Sri Aurobindo also uses that particular center, and he says that what we call the soul entity lives there. And that is what he's calling the psychic being. The psychic being, in the Indian tradition, we've used the term Atman. But Atman itself is very nebulous. We don't know what is the location of the Atman. But some of the Upanishads, the Katha Upanishad, uses the term Antaratman. Ekam tatha sarva bhutantaratma. So sarva bhuta, all things, all entities, within them there is an Atman, Antaratman. That Atman within is the psychic being, is the soul entity that is within all beings. In the Gita also, Krishna will say, I turn beings as on a wheel from within themselves. So that psychic, that immanent divine entity in each individualized immanence of the divine is one of the integrating factors of all these 7 chakras in the Sri Aurobindo teaching. And the way one can get at that is to gather everything, try to bring everything together to a center inside the heart and offer it to a transcendent source. Again, just like Staneshwar was saying, this is not a duality. You're not offering it to somebody else. You're offering it to your own origin, from which you are now separated due to a hidden gulf. And so to reconnect with that, with your own highest, you have to gather yourself, by cultivating these forms or kinds of consciousness, we can open up these kinds, but we have to then gather them and bring them to an integral point and turn them up through a kind of integral prayer. So prayer in the Christian tradition or whatever tradition does prayers is usually a voice thing. We actually give content to it in words. But if we intensify it enough, we don't need words. The words go away. It's just a pure movement of consciousness. And that is the idea of the psychic prayer. It's a directing call to the transcendent divine. It's just directing pure energy. And that is the source of our affective life, our emotions. That is the quintessence of our emotions. But there is another movement of the emotions, and that is the emotional life of the vital, which is the heart, Anahata Chakra, which is expansive. And that has to be cultivated through compassion. and also through exposure to aesthetics. The more we become sensitive to aesthetic values, we find that our depth understanding of human compassion increases. We understand the universality of what it means to be human. And growing that actually opens up that form of consciousness. Finally, we come to the forms of mental consciousness. The Vishuddhi chakra has to do with expression. And if we cultivate writing, many people think that I was not born to be a writer or to be an orator or speaker. But everybody can, you see, in part of the modernist movement, there was the surrealist movement. Surrealists felt that everybody is a poet. They just, even if it's nonsense, they should exercise their ability, their right to write nonsense. And if they do it, at a certain point, it will become their own sense. They will feel empowered. They will feel that something else is speaking through them. And that becoming a channel in expression opens up that particular form of consciousness, or kind of consciousness. And then the center between the eyes is that of sense intuition. By imagination, visualization, we cultivate it and we give it more full expression through telepathy. It is both receptive as well as expressive. In other words, we can receive thoughts as well as send out thoughts using that particular level of consciousness. And finally, there is the idea of the cosmic planes of mind above, what has been expressed. And those cosmic planes can be accessed through meditation above the head. You can become very quiet and feel that there is something above the head. And that cosmic being, or cosmic consciousness, is something that you can connect with and that can respond to you. And then, as I said, through our academic attempt to become more universal, through comparative studies, or holistic studies, or structuralist studies, we help that cosmic part of our mind to become more active. So, I would like to end here, but maybe short meditation, which we can do. And this, what I would recommend is a integrating meditation. So the idea will be to close our eyes, and I'm going to focus on 3 points in our, actually let's say 4 points in our structure. First, we close our eyes and focus on the Muladhara, the center at the bottom of the spine. We just focus our attention there without any premeditation. Try to be quiet and try to just focus and feel that we are experiencing our attention at the base of the spine. As we do that, we also feel that there is a young girl child over there. So gradually we bring our attention up the spine towards the heart. And as we do that, we also feel that that little girl is growing up. And now we bring our attention to our heart. But at the same time, some of our attention is still on the base of the spine. It is as if both are in our attention field. And here the little girl has become a 16-year-old young girl child, a mature woman in puberty. She is very beautiful. And by the power of her imagination, she creates a mate for herself. He stands next to her. Together they hold hands and look upwards. And all the energy that they have carried from the base of the spine travel upwards. And your attention rises till it's between the eyes. And the two rise with it. And they're seated together between the eyes. They've grown into adults. But their gaze is still fixed upwards, above the head. All is quiet. There is only silence. And they call down something from above. They're looking up and they're calling something down. They're calling their own higher reality down. So they can experience a stirring above the head. And then they catch a glimpse of this great empress and her consort above the head, seated on a throne. On a resplendent, in a resplendent sun. And the rays of light from that sun come down. Come into the heads of these seated figures between the eyes. Come further down to the heart. So this time one feels the meeting of the currents. The two currents meet in the heart. just relax into that feeling. The great radiation that comes from that meeting place. We try to be conscious that all along the spine our attention is a single field. From the base of the spine right up to above the head. And it is integrated at the heart. Gradually, as you feel, you can bring yourself into waking consciousness. And closer to the surface. And feel up to it.
Thank you, Devashi. Let us give it.